The Complete and Unabridged Story of Christmas Oranges. Chapter 1. Many years ago, near Christmas time, as I was walking down a corridor in a convalescent home, I saw a resident, a gentleman I had recently met, sitting outside in a patio. His name was Steve. Steve waved to me and asked me to join him. I was in the building on other business, and I really didn't want to spend my time talking with someone I didn't know very well. But I was aware that the number one product in a convalescent home was loneliness. So reluctantly, I went out to join him. Steve was eating an orange, and as we passed a few pleasantries, he asked me if I wanted one. At first I declined, but Steve insisted. He said that the oranges were exceptionally delicious and that I would enjoy one. Patronizingly, I said, "Okay, Steve, sure, I'd like one of your oranges." Steve was right, by the way. The orange was very sweet and delicious. As we were eating, Steve said to me, "You know, that orange you're eating is a special orange." I thought to myself the orange was good, but not particularly different from any other. So I said to him, "What's special about this orange?" That's when he told me the following story. Chapter 2. Steve said in 1940, when he was a young man, he had been working for one of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's public works programs. Many people couldn't find jobs in those days. Steve was one of them. So when the government offered men room and board and pay to boot for work that government would provide, he accepted. Steve was assigned to a crew that built levees along the Tennessee River. The purpose of the work was to prevent flooding and to direct water to dams that produce electricity through huge hydroelectric generators. Steve was very good with his hands. He liked being outdoors, and he enjoyed the work. In the fall of that year, Steve and the crew he worked with were assigned to build earthen abutments along one of the small tributaries that fed into the Tennessee River. Since the project would take many weeks to complete, the crew constructed a barracks type of dormitory near a small town called Sandy Fork, where the crew was going to stay. Every night after work, the crew members would go into that town, and Steve, being a gregarious type, got to know some of the shop owners. One day, the owner of a general store asked Steve to construct a modest-sized warehouse behind the store which would hold his surplus merchandise. The owner said he would provide all of the lumber materials and tools that Steve would need. Most of it was prefabricated, and Steve could put the building up in his spare time after work. Steve and the owner agreed on a fee, shook hands, and the next day after work, Steve began to construct the building. Steve's crew was scheduled to complete their assignment by Christmas, and then they would move to another job the day after. Part of the agreement Steve had made with the store owner was that he wouldn't be paid anything unless he completed all the work before he left. So every day after shoring up the banks along the river, Steve would appear at the store and work on the new warehouse. He worked hard and fast, and he did beautiful work because he took pride in what he did. Chapter 3. On the evening of December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, Steve completed all the work on the warehouse, and he went to the store owner to collect the pay they had agreed upon. The owner inspected the building and agreed that Steve had done a good job, but said he wasn't able to pay him. "Times are hard," the owner said. "A lot of people owe me money and can't pay me. I know that I agreed to pay you and you have earned it, but I just don't have the money to give you." The owner said he felt badly and all that, but it couldn't be helped. Then the owner said that all he could give Steve were 3 crates of oranges in place of the money he owed him. At that moment, Steve realized that he had been cheated. He would not be able to collect the money owed him because he couldn't stay behind to argue with the store owner. His crew had completed all of their work in that area and was scheduled to move on to another work site the day after Christmas. And he suspected that the store owner offered him the oranges because he wasn't able to sell them and they were probably going bad. Steve was upset by the situation, but he knew there was nothing he could do about it. He didn't have the time or the resources to sue the store owner, and he knew that the oranges were no good to him because he wouldn't be able to eat all before they went bad. So there was no point in taking them with him when he left. Then he got a wild idea. Since the oranges were all that were offered to him and he couldn't use them, he decided that he would give an orange to every man, woman, and child in Sandy Fork as a Christmas present. In the store was a very large stack of Christmas cards tied up in a bundle. Steve said to the owner, "Throw in that bundle of Christmas cards and you've got a deal." The owner gladly agreed. Chapter 4. The next day was December 24th, Christmas Eve, and since the crew had completed their work early, Steve had the day off. So he rose bright and early and began visiting all the homes in Sandy Fork. At each place he would knock on the door, introduce himself, and give one orange for each man, woman, and child who had lived in that home. He also gave them a card in which he had written, "May the spirit of the season be with you on this holy day and throughout the new year to come. Steve." If nobody was home, he would ask a neighbor how many people lived in that place, and he would leave the oranges and a card on the porch. By the end of that day, Steve had visited every home in that little town, and he had given every resident an orange. Of the 3 crates that he started with, he had only 5 oranges left, and he thought that he would keep them for himself. But one of the townspeople who had seen what Steve had been doing told him, "There's one more family you haven't visited. They live across the river up that hill. Just follow the road and you won't miss it." Steve looked where the man was pointing and saw a road winding up the mountain. Steve had enjoyed giving out his oranges, and he was determined to give everyone to every person in that town. But it was late in the day, the sun was already setting, and the house was some distance away. So Steve decided that he would deliver his last oranges early the next morning. Then he would come back to town, attend church services, and go to the Christmas party that the church had planned and had invited his crew to. Chapter 5. The next morning, Christmas Day, Steve woke early and discovered that it had snowed the night before. But he was determined to give an orange to every man, woman, and child in Sandy Fork, so he set out on his journey. He had to walk some distance before he found a place to cross the river. Then he had to hike up that road that wound up the mountain. He said that it wasn't that the hike was long, but the road up the hill was steep, and the snow had drifted into great piles. He said that in some places the snow was as high as his chest. But Steve was young and strong and full of vinegar, so he just pushed through the snow and kept going. When Steve arrived at the top of the mountain, he followed the road through a lovely forest. Finally, he turned through some trees, and stretched out before him he saw the most beautiful little farm he had ever seen. There was a horse corral to the right of the road, and a stable and a solid barn behind. Open fields for crops lay beyond that. A vineyard and an orchard stood on the left. In the middle of all this stood a large white farmhouse that glowed with light from within. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney and seemed to offer a warm caress to those inside. The entire area was covered in peaceful white snow and ice and looked like an idyllic painting by Currier and Ives. As Steve looked upon all this beauty, he couldn't help but think of his own impoverished circumstances, and he thought to himself, "These people have so much, they couldn't possibly care about my oranges." He felt embarrassed, ashamed for what he was and what he didn't have, but he was determined to give an orange to every man, woman, and child in the town. So he walked up to the house, but instead of knocking on the door, like he had been doing, he placed his last 5 oranges on the wide porch. He didn't even keep one for himself. On top of the oranges, he placed a card in which he had written, "May the spirit of the season be with you on this holy day and throughout the New Year's to come. Steve." Then he turned and left. By the time Steve got back to the barracks in Sandy Fork, the day was half gone. It had taken him a lot longer to make the hike up the mountain than he had expected. He had missed the church service, and the party was already started. He was cold, wet, dirty, and not feeling very good about himself. So he took a hot shower and went to bed. He didn't want to face anybody. Early the next morning, December 26th, the day after Christmas, a transport truck arrived. Steve walked out of the barracks, climbed on the board with the rest of his crew, and let the truck carry him away to the next work site. He didn't look back and he never saw Sandy Fork again. Chapter 6. Sometime later, World War II began. Steve was drafted into the Army. He volunteered for the Army Air Corps. He was trained as a mechanic and was shipped to England, where he became a crew chief for bombers that flew missions over Europe. Then, when the war was over, the military brought Steve back to the United States, gave him an honorable discharge and a GI Bill. He moved to Southern California, got a job in what was then known as the aviation industry. He met a woman, fell in love, got married, bought a home in Inglewood, California, and started raising a family. Years went by. Chapter 7. 1956. Along about Christmas time, Steve went out to get the mail. He pulled the little door open, and inside he found a box. He said it was about 4 inches square. There was no return address on it. It just said his name, Steve, and his address in Inglewood, California. He opened the box, and inside he found an orange. He said he thought about Sandy Fork, but there was nothing to connect the orange with the little town. No explanation, no postmark, no return address, just his name and address on the front. Steve, Inglewood, California. In time, he forgot about it and went on with his life. The next year, along about Christmas time, Steve went out to get the mail and found another box, another orange. No note, no explanation, no return address. The following year, he received a bigger box, 2 oranges. The year after that, an even bigger box, 4 oranges. For the next Christmas, he received a bag, 12 oranges. In the years that followed, he received oranges from all around the world. He received a box of oranges from Florida. Then he received tangy oranges from Spain, large oranges from South Africa. One year, dainty oranges from Japan. The next, huge oranges from Australia. He received specialty oranges from every place that grew oranges, but never did he receive a note, a return address, or an explanation. Finally, he came home one day to find his living room filled with boxes, so many boxes that he couldn't walk through his house. He said that in those days there was a specialty company that produced and sold collections of holiday fruits. This company set out a catalog each fall advertising all the types and combinations of fruits, nuts, and dates that they offered. At the back of the catalog, the company offered their largest assortment, 1 box each of every item they produced. It was a prodigious amount of fruit and very expensive. That was what filled his living room that year. Steve's curiosity finally got the better of him, and he had to find out who had been sending him all those oranges. So he called the company and asked them for the name of the person who had sent him the present. The company very politely informed him that they could not give out the name or phone number of their customers. So Steve told the company, "What if I gave you my name, and what if I gave you my phone number? Could you contact your customer and ask them to call me?" The company said, yes, they could do that. Chapter 8. 2 weeks later, Steve's wife received a phone call. The man on the phone said he was the person who had sent the oranges, and could he speak to Steve? Steve's wife said that Steve wasn't home, but told the man when he could call back. Sometime later, the phone rang and Steve answered. The man on the phone asked if this was Steve. Steve said yes. The man asked if this was the Steve who gave away oranges in Sandy Fork on Christmas in 1940. Steve said yes, it was. The man said, "I'm the guy who's been sending you oranges." Steve said, "Thank you very much, but why? Why have you been sending me oranges all these years?" The man said he would answer that question, but he wanted to ask a favor. He wanted to answer the question in person. Could he possibly visit Steve? Steve said he supposed so, but why would the man want to answer in person? The man said, "I want to meet you, and I want my son to meet you." Chapter 9. At the appointed time, Steve and his family were at home, and the man arrived with his son, a boy about 10 years old. After introducing themselves, they sat down to talk. Steve asked him, "So tell me, why did you send me all those oranges all these years?" The man said, "I'll tell you, but first I'd like to make sure you're the right person. Your name is Steve, and you were in Sandy Fork at Christmas time in 1940. Steve said, "Yes." "And for Christmas presents, you passed out oranges to all the people in that town?" "Yes." "If you don't mind, I would like to hear the story from your point of view. Why did you do that?" So Steve told the story of how he had made an agreement with the store owner, how he had been cheated, and how he got the idea to pass out the oranges as presents because he wouldn't have been able to eat them all. When Steve finished reading his story, the man said, "That's it. That's why I've been sending you presents every year." Steve said, "I don't understand. They were just oranges. They weren't valuable or anything. I couldn't use them all and they would just have spoiled. What you sent me, all those oranges from all around the world all these years, must have been a lot of trouble and very expensive. Why did you do it?" Then the man asked Steve, "Do you remember a house across the river from the town? A house up a steep hill and back behind a little wooded area? A pretty house with a corral and a stable and a barn surrounded by an orchard and a vineyard?" Steve said, "Yes, I remember that house. I remember it very well. If you lived in that house, you must have been very rich. Why would you care about a few oranges?" The man paused and said, "I was 10 years old that year. I was in that house that day. We didn't own that property. It belonged to some rich guy from the city who liked to play gentleman rancher in the summer times. It was the height of the Depression, and my father was out of work. He had made a deal with the real estate manager. My father would watch over the property and keep it safe. In exchange, me, my mother, and my father, my sister, and my little brother, we would be allowed to live in the house for the winter. There was no pay for doing this. My father had to feed us on his own. He ran out of money, so he had gone into the city to look for work. The house was big and cold, and when my father was gone, we ran out of firewood. There was almost no food left to eat. My mother got sick with what we later found out was pneumonia. I was worried, very worried. My father wasn't there. My mother was ill, and I felt it was up to me to take care of her, my sister, and my little brother. When my mother got worse, I decided that we couldn't stay in that house any longer. I had to get help. I planned to wake up early the next morning and take my mother into Sandy Fork. Then it started to snow. As I watched out the window, it snowed all night. The snow filled the road and covered the barn, the house, and all the trees. It snowed so much that finally we were snowed in. We couldn't get out. That night, Christmas Eve, I prayed for a miracle. I prayed that my father would come back, that a neighbor would come by. I prayed for anything that would help. The next morning, Christmas Day, I put on my jacket and went out on the porch. When I saw those oranges in that card, I looked up and realized that somebody had cut a path through all that snow. I tucked that card in my shirt and stuffed those oranges in my pockets. I went back into the house, bundled up my mother, got my sister and my little brother, and I walked my family down off that mountain. We made our way across the river and into Sandy Fork. I knocked on doors, asking people, begging people for help. Finally, a woman took pity on us and called a man she knew. That man brought a truck and drove us down to the city. Somehow, the people there contacted my father, and he joined us. We spent Christmas night gathered around the foot of a bed in the charity ward of the county hospital. My little brother was fussing, and my father asked him what was wrong. My brother said, "It's Christmas, and we didn't get any presents." My father said, "Yes, we did." Then he put that card on the nightstand, and he passed out those oranges. And you know something? They were delicious. The man stopped talking. Everyone was quiet for a moment. Then the man's son stood up, walked over to Steve, and handed him a huge, perfectly shaped orange and said, "Thank you. Thank you for what you did for my dad." Chapter 10. That's the story as Steve told it to me. He said he received oranges every year along about Christmas time. He said they were special. Steve is gone now. He's been gone for a long while, but his story lives on. It lives on in me. And Steve's story reminds me not to question the value of simple acts of kindness, not to question them at Christmas time or any other time of the year, because we can never know how far a kindness will travel or how much good it might do. So just put them out in the world and let them do their work. As for me, Steve's story has changed my life, improved it, I think. Every orange I see reminds me of how I should behave, and because of that, for me, all the oranges I see are Christmas oranges.